me. And then change over here. There we go. All right. Well, thank you for that excellent introduction. Thank you everyone for having us. Good evening. Really excited to be here. Like Bronwyn mentioned, my name is Sierra Patterson, as you can also see by the lovely name that's displayed on my screen. And I am the Delaware Quail Forever farm biologist, and I'm gonna kind of get us started. So kicking off, this is just gonna be a quick overview of what Jack and I will be covering. These are some of our presentation topics. And I'll be starting with a brief introduction just to go over Quail Forever as an organization, and then give some background on what our positions are. And then Jack is going to give us a little bit of a history lesson to go over the history of bobwhite in our region, and then reasons for their decline and what their population status kind of is today, or where it stands today. And then I'm going to give us an overview of what bobwhite habitat looks like. And Jack is going to finish us off with kind of applying how we can apply that new habitat knowledge that we have, how we can apply it at home, some options for financial assistance if you're interested in kind of putting some of that habitat on the ground. And then he's going to give us some real world examples. So just going into what is Quail Forever. You'll see probably in the description for this webinar that it did mention Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. So we are the same. We do focus mostly on quail here in Maryland and Delaware. And that specifically is the bobwhite quail or the Northern Bobwhite. And that is because they are the only quail species that we have this part of the United States. But Quail Forever, Pheasants Forever is nationwide. It's a nationwide nonprofit. So they do also focus on some of those, on the other quail species that we also have here in the US. But ultimately our goal, our mission is to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, and conservation advocacy. This is just a quick little kind of introduction to us. There's some of our contact information. If you ever have any follow-up questions from this webinar, you're more than welcome to send us an email or give us a call. We'll have our information at the end as well. But Jack covers the eastern shore of Maryland, and then I cover Delaware. But the information that we give you is gonna pretty much apply, to all of Maryland in terms of, the kind of habitat we're looking to create and everything. We're both farm bill biologists. And so we are kind of the definition of that is we're employees of Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, but we are funded mostly through a federal grant known as Working Lands for Wildlife. And that is a partnership with NRCS, or the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is under USDA. And basically, they have a lot of programs under the federal farm bill that are available for agricultural producers. Chicken farmers, those tend to be the most common, this part of the states. And kind of the idea is to conserve water, soil, air, kind of keeping those wildlife as well, keeping those things sustainable. So because their programs cater so closely to kind of what Quail Forever's mission is, they started creating these positions, these farm bill biologist positions, to where we can get more boots on the ground, more biologists out on the ground working with landowners to help them with their habitat. So Working Lands for Wildlife is all across the US, just like Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. And these are kind of some of the different regions, but it kind of lists some of the more specific programs that they have and shows some of the regions as well throughout. Okay, this is the part I'm going to go into some of the life history of quail, or bobwhite specifically.
This is the history part. So can
Oh,
you hear
I'm
me,
sorry.
by the way? Can you hear me? You good? Yeah. Okay, cool. So now we're going to get into the history of quail in our region. So the Mid-Atlantic was once known as an area that had a tremendous quail population. From early settlement, when Europeans came over, really starting in the mid 1600s, small scale farming took down a lot of the forests in the region and really increased quail habitat because they will utilize more like field environments. And those subsistence farmers, which really we had here on the eastern side of the bay until um, until really the 20th century, produced a lot of crops that had, there was a decent amount of waste with those, and also lots of weeds and insects that came to those fields that really produced an abundant quail population. Um, but then kind of starting in the mid to late 1800s, market hunting became a really strong pressure on quail. And actually the first documented decline that we know of in the US was in the 1890s for quail population. And it really has mostly been a downhill slope since. Um, so here's data from the North American Breeding Bird Survey. You may be familiar with this. Some of you may have even volunteered with this before. It's a nationwide effort around this time of year where people will go out and they'll do a BBS breeding survey, a breeding bird survey route, where they drive along and they stop at a set number of points on that route and they count what's there. So here we have data from the Mid-Atlantic region. Sierra and I work with 3 Virginia biologists as well. That's why Virginia's on here too. And we didn't collect this data, but obviously because it's starting in the 60s. But from that start, you can see kind of this precipitous decline in the number of quail that have been detected here in the Mid-Atlantic. And if you looked at this continent-wide, it would look similar. I do want to note that this is quail counted on routes. So that means if there's more routes in the state, there's going to be more quail because it's just an overall number, which is why Maryland may look like more of a drop than the others. Um, but you can really see that, there's been a general decline, and in Maryland and Delaware, almost a complete flat line in the past 15 years or so. Um, so, that kind of begs the question of what happened to quail. I did have some fun transitions, but they're all kind of popping up now. So you can kind of see these are some of the big 3. There's several other factors too that all just kind of eat at the edges for quail. But one big one, especially in our region here in Maryland and Delaware, is urban sprawl. Um, we've essentially lost quail on much of the western shore of the bay, and urban sprawl is a one of the major factors for that. Intensive agriculture is another one. It's just, you're starting to use chemicals. You're starting to kind of use that less productive land, and you're able to amend it to make it more productive, and you lose those kind of marginal areas that quail would have lived. You remove hedgerows to make it more efficient. Your machinery gets larger and larger. Just, as that happens, you lose everything else that's on the landscape that supported these birds. And then the third one is succession. So, some of those less productive areas in the environment, like maybe your little wet areas or fence row that you don't touch anymore, you pretty much, a lot of people, instead of putting effort into it, they've recognized maybe they're not getting anything out of disturbing that ground anymore. So they just leave it alone. And over time, that will succeed into forest. And forest is good, but forest is not quail habitat. And some forest, really to have a healthy forest, it can help to thin it out. So just kind of letting it go isn't necessarily the best thing, especially for quail in our region. Another big factor is fire. So back in the day, starting, pre-settlement, way pre-settlement, we had fires year round in this region. I'll talk a little bit more about the frequency on the next slide, but fires would have occurred between, May and October from lightning strikes, the time of year we get thunderstorms, and also fire was set by Native Americans to bolster game populations from when they came to the Americas, 20,000 years plus ago. So it's been on the landscape for a long time. So it happened quite frequently, and because of that frequency, it happened also with a low intensity. So we're not talking stand replacing fires like you'd see on the news about the West Coast, where you have crowning fires in the canopy of these old, Douglas firs in the mountains. It wasn't anything like that. It was low running fires, removing the leaf litter, maybe removing some grass duff, leaving you with blackened earth, yes, but also providing light to a lot of forb and grass seeds so that they could then sprout and create quail habitat. And it maintained really what most of at least the eastern two-thirds of the state was, which was kind of this woodland savanna complex rather than a closed canopy forest. Where, like, woodland's kind of like I would say maybe a slightly lighter forest. But a lot of our drier areas, not in a drainage, kind of in drier soils where they're sandy or a little more well drained, you would have almost had savanna-like conditions where the crowns of trees wouldn't even touch. So you really had a lot of light there. And it does kind of look like a forest, but it's a world of difference between extremely dark forests that we live with across most of the state today. And here's kind of a map. This is a pretty cool figure on fire frequency across the US. So obviously we're up here in Maryland and Delaware. And historically, we would have had fire anywhere from every 4 to 12 years, essentially everywhere that's not Garrett County out in Western Maryland. And here in Maryland and Delaware, it probably on average would have been every 5 to 7 years. And if you look at the Northern Bobwhite geographic range, you can see that it matches this almost perfectly, which led the renowned prescribed fire and quail researcher Herbert Stoddard from Tall Timbers, which is a research station down here in northern Florida and southern Georgia, to call the Northern Bobwhite the firebird. And that still stands true. Sierra will talk a little bit more about how that's important in a little bit too. So I also want to bring up succession again. So here's this cool land cover data set from, I can't remember where this is from right now, but this is the upper eastern shore and kind of like central Delaware. So here on the right, you can see Dover, northern Kent County, and southern Newcastle, where there's a bit more forest. Over here is Chestertown, so this is Kent and Queen Anne's County in Maryland. And you can see that the trees have really just gotten more and more dense and older over time. And there really isn't that lighter colored tree cover anymore, which means everywhere that's forest is pretty dense nowadays. And if you pay attention to where those trees have really grown in, you can see here from this figure from the 80s on perennial forbs and grasses, which really is quail habitat, which again, Sierra will talk about in a little bit. We've almost lost that from the landscape unless it's actively being managed for in these bright green spots from the 2024 data set here. And a lot of that has grown up into forest nowadays. So that's succession slowly removing quail habitat from the landscape. And now Sierra will get into life history and some habitat stuff with quail.
Okay. Yes, this is the part where I do the life history. So just kind of going over first, now that we have some insight into bobwhite decline, we kind of understand how crucial habitat is. And we're going to understand a little bit more as we kind of go through this, as well as how important habitat connectivity is. So I'm going to just get a little bit deeper into that. But before we get into the actual kind of habitat needs of quail, we're going to look kind of at the life history to have some background in that, so that we can understand what those different habitat factors, understand a little bit more why they need those habitat factors. So starting kind of at the beginning of the calendar year, January, February, starting more so in the spring, I should say. So we're starting with, kind of the April, May, June kind of time frame, late spring into maybe very early summer. And that is when you're getting a lot of your breeding going on. So that's when you hear the really iconic bobwhite, that the male bobs, or that we like to call them male bobs, will sing and call so that, you know, obviously they can attract a female. And then moving later into the summer, we then get into nesting season. So obviously at that time, you know, the females are nesting. Sometimes they're kind of their dynamic and how they raise young is it sort of depends. It's not the same all the time. It's pretty dynamic. So sometimes the females will raise them completely when they hatch, and they'll watch over the nest. Sometimes it'll be the males. Sometimes it'll be both the male and female. So it is kind of dynamic, but that's happening through a fairly good portion of the summer, and they can re-nest multiple times. So if they have a failed nest, they can go back in and have another. Although there have been studies done to kind of show that as the time or as the summer goes on, those nests tend to be less successful. They also have less eggs as they kind of go through that. And then as we kind of start to hit fall, we start to have covey formations. And so that is when they are all basically coming together for the fall and moving into the winter, and they'll stay in these coveys. The coveys kind of make this coily sound, and that's so that they can kind of find each other and know where each other are. And they will stay in these groups for the entire winter. And it's pretty funny in the, you know, there's actually drone footage that have thermal cameras from above. And basically what they do at nighttime is they'll all sit with their backs to each other in a circle. So you can actually see that in thermal imaging, and it's just like a red ring on the ground, which is pretty neat. And then once you start hitting the really late kind of winter, you know, they'll continue to stay together until it starts to warm up again, and then the cycle starts over. But like I said, they'll stay in those coveys all throughout late fall into throughout the harsh winter until it starts warming up again. So looking at what kind of habitat they need. Quail are, they need early successional habitat. When we kind of look at what early successional habitat is, you know, succession is that natural progression, like what you can see on this graph of, you know, you start with kind of just exposed rock. And then over time, you'll get lichens, mosses, you'll eventually get some annual weeds, then you start getting perennial weeds, forbs, and then you start getting shrubs, and then that eventually successes into smaller trees, and then larger trees, and eventually have a mature forest. So no matter what, you'll have this succession, you know, in this part of the country, we'll always have that succession into a mature forest if it is not disturbed. So, you know, what quail need when we're talking about early successional is kind of that like annual, perennial, and then some shrubs in there as well. So kind of what's circled on the screen there. And you know, that can kind of take over fairly quickly. You can have essentially a grassland, and within a few years you can have already some small trees that are kind of starting to take over. And before long, it'll start to grow up enough to where you start blocking sunlight to the ground because of canopy closure. And we're not talking mature forest, obviously, that takes some time, but it doesn't take long to kind of move away from that early successional habitat if it doesn't have that regular disturbance. So looking a little bit more into what quail specifically need in this early successional kind of stage, when we look at food for quail, they are eating some small berries, they're eating seeds and legumes from a lot of different forb wildflower species. And these, you know, this diversity of forbs wildflowers also attracts a lot of insects. And the chicks are eating about 90% insects when they are when they're growing, because they need a lot of protein to get up to size pretty quickly. Water is pretty much from the same source. So adults are also eating insects. They just don't eat as much once they get of age. Obviously, they don't need as much protein because they've kind of gotten to size, but they are still eating insects. They get a lot of their water from those insects. So there's not normally too much of a need for standing water to be there unless you're in an extremely dry area within their range, where you may occasionally need some supplemental water, but we don't really have to worry about that here on the East Coast. For shelter, and this one is a big one for quail, they need overhead shelter, and they need escape cover, and then they need winter cover. Because we're kind of on the northern part of Bobwhite's range, the quail here have to worry a lot more about winter than they do down in Florida. So having a really dense shrubby, whether it's, a shrub itself or, just a dense bunch of greenbrier or blackberry, having that to kind of go under and have almost like a dome that they can get under to hide themselves from really heavy snow events. So like what we had this past winter, it's really important that they have that structure to go under. And the same thing for predator cover. They need to be able to flush. They don't tend to really fly too many places. They tend to be on the ground until something pushes them up to where they feel like they have to get away quickly. And then they'll flush for a certain distance and then they'll go back down. So having that shrubby cover for them to hide from different species, different predators is really important. And then also while they're eating, having overhead cover while they're, kind of foraging and things like that. So the forbs and things are still kind of covering them. They can't just be out in the open because, there's obviously a lot of things that want to eat quail, raptors and foxes and things like that. So having that cover is important. Overhead cover is important as well. And then the last thing is space. And that's also something that isn't super talked about. We are trying to push that more. And, you can have your shelter, you can have enough, food available through all the different forbs you have and everything. But if everything isn't managed in a way to where the ground can be open enough, there's still overhead cover and there's still places to escape, but having some sort of bare ground to where they can move. A lot of times, the chicks are the size of your thumb when they hatch. So they need to be able to move through an area to be able to forage. So if you think about rolling a golf ball through whatever it may be, it can be through a field or whatever kind of area you have. If it doesn't roll through there fairly easily, then a chick can't make it through there. So, a lot of times people will have all of these other aspects, but then it isn't managed in a way to maintain that bare ground, and that dead plant material will just layer and layer and layer over time. And then that creates a really dense thatch layer that they can't move through. So overall, when we look at these different components, we look at the rule of thirds. So starting with grasses, some sort of bunch grass, native bunch grass is usually what we're looking for. And that is what they're nesting in primarily. They don't create a nest really. They'll usually just sort of like make a little divot in the base of the grass, and that is kind of the nest. So that is what they mostly rely on. So I say that thatch, it's important not to have too much thatch, but some, grasses that are available for them to nest in are important. The native grasses, it's also an important factor to consider that they are native, because certain species that are not native, like fescue, they create this really dense mat, and chicks can't thermoregulate for the first 2 weeks of life. So they really rely on those grasses to kind of go into and to be able to thermoregulate. The dense grasses, they tend to hold too much temperature, whatever it may be, and it doesn't allow them to thermoregulate well enough. And then the next aspect is shrubs. So like I mentioned, that kind of dense forming, either an actual shrub itself, it can be a really young cedar tree, it can be a really young holly tree. As long as they're kind of maintained and lopped enough to where they keep growing back in sort of that shrubby formation. Once they get too tall, it's not really serving that purpose anymore. So again, you can imagine with a really heavy snow, having that kind of dome that they can go under. And then same thing if they're getting chased by a predator. If there's a fox coming after them, they should be able to get in there and get under there, and then a fox shouldn't be able to easily get in there. So that's kind of the idea behind that. And then the last thing is forbs. That is going to be their primary food source. So that's attracting the insects that are their food source. And then that is also the seeds, legumes, that variety that they're also eating as well. All right. So usually when I'm kind of in front of an audience, I do this activity. I'm just obviously because we're not face to face. I'm still going to go through it because it's kind of fun and it gets your brain thinking a little bit as we're going through this. But basically, based on the information that I gave you, I want you to kind of look at this screen and think about what this area has for the quail and what it does not have for the quail. So we have our bob kind of bobbing around there. And this is our first scenario. So, kind of the thought process is he has plenty of space, he's got plenty of bare ground, but he has nothing else. So we're going to give that one a thumbs down. Moving on, we can see, okay, we have grasses now. Okay, so that's kind of an improvement. He at least has some sort of cover. The grasses do kind of give some sort of, cover, overhead cover. But the problem is there's not as much space anymore. You can't really see any bare ground in there. There's also no diversity. This is a monoculture. This is a single species of grass. It's hard to tell from this picture, but it's also not a native species. So it's kind of taking over the area. So this one's also a thumbs down. Okay, so this is a little bit better. So we do have a diversity of grasses. These are native bunch grasses. We do have space, but what we don't have forbs. And again, they don't really have any good thermal cover or good winter cover, good predator cover. Those grasses don't do too much. It's a little bit, but again, if a fox is chasing them, they can't just hop into big blue stem and expect to not get eaten. So we're gonna give that one a thumbs down too. But we're getting there. We're making progress. Okay, so what we have a diversity of native grasses, but we still have enough bare ground for them to be able to move around in. And then we have a lot more forbs now. So this is introducing or, attracting a variety of insects. It's producing a lot of seeds for them to feed from. It's providing that overhead cover as they feed. But the only thing is we're still missing one more thing. So we're giving it a thumbs down. We're going to move on to the next one and see. And it is that thermal cover. That's the kind of the last thing, that winter predator cover that we're looking for. So again, it doesn't need to be a huge dense thicket of a single clump. They can be kind of spread throughout again so they can flush from one to the other. It's not like a whole area has to be shrubs. Obviously, we want the diversity. So this is a pretty good scenario here. Okay. And so it's important to remember that quail are an umbrella species. So if you're managing for quail, you're managing for deer, turkey, a variety of grassland shrubland birds, which are also declining. That's one of the fastest declining habitat types. Early successional plants, pollinators, and many others. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention pollinators in this. This past week was Pollinator Week. So they have this every year in June, and that's to bring attention to our pollinators. So, again, everything that you're doing for quail habitat, you're also managing for pollinators. Pollinators are important because they are allocating, or they are helping to pollinate 80% of all flowering plants, and they can help pollinate up to 35% of the world's food crops, which is 1 in every 3 bites of food. And this is animal pollinators that we're talking about. And we have to remember that that these products that we have, it's not just food. The drinks that we consume, the spices, the fibers that we use, medicines, dyes, those all come from, or usually come from some sort of vegetative base, which is, it needs to be able to create that product, whether it's a seed or a fruit or whatever it may be. It needs to be pollinated in order to continue on and for us to be able to use it. So looking at who are these pollinators. So there are over 100,000 invertebrate pollinators. This is, kind of throughout the world, but it does apply a lot to the US. So kind of starting with bees is the most obvious of the pollinators that we usually think of. They are the most numerous and effective pollinators. We say effective because they carry the most pollen. There are around 4,000 native bees that contribute to agricultural pollination. So it's important to remember. We a lot of times think about the European honeybee, but they're not native. And it's important to remember we have a lot of native bees that are also serving the same purpose. So mason bees, sweat bees, and bumblebees are just a couple examples. And some other invertebrate pollinators that are a little bit less known other than butterflies are ants, wasps, flies, beetles, and moths are also some big ones. And then, of course, we have to pay attention to the vertebrates as well. So there are more than 1,000 vertebrates that are considered pollinators. So mammals, birds, reptiles, some mammals like bat species. There are some bird species that are pollinators. And then not necessarily here in the US, but in other parts of the world, reptiles can also serve as pollinators. So making a connection, again, we talk about connectivity. For quail being able to move from one area to the other, they need connected habitat. And it's just as important for pollinators. The best example I like to use is the monarch. They can travel up to 3,000 miles in their single, migration down south to overwinter. And if they don't have enough food sources to feed off of as they are traveling, then they won't make it. So having that contiguous habitat is really, really important. And then just really quickly, this is what we went over for quail, but sort of tying it back to how the same quail habitat factors tie into helping pollinators. Looking at food, so all the different forbs that you're providing for quail are just as important, obviously, for pollinators, for the pollen that they're looking for and the nectar that they're looking for. So having a variety of those native species. And then for shelter, pollinators use similar shelter to quail. So, using those empty stems in the forbs as they, go dormant over the winter, or the empty kind of like maybe the brush or the sticks that are there in brush piles or in those different native shrubs. They use those for overwintering a lot of times and for nesting. And then space, kind of going back to that bare ground, there are a lot of native ground nesting bees that really rely on having access to that bare soil, just like quail need as well. All right, and I'm going to pass it over to Jack.
You, Sierra. All right, I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of management practices. I'm going to talk briefly about kind of what Sierra and I do on a day-to-day dealing with the paperwork side of things and the money side of things, and then I'll show you a couple examples at the end. So for management practices, you talk about that habitat and everything, and that's great. But the nitty-gritty happens when you start thinking about how you implement those to create quail habitat. Because as you may have gathered from Sierra talking about quail habitat, quail need pretty specific things. They are a habitat specialist. They specialize in that early successional or that herbaceous vegetation with some shrubs type habitat. Stuff that unless you're managing for it these days, you usually don't have it. So you have to be aware of how you might be able to create or enhance it. And these are some things that Sierra and I usually go through. Recommend landowners that are interested in doing things for quail or for other wildlife. And the cool thing about that is quail are specialists, but what quail like, most other wildlife will benefit from, as Sierra talked about for the umbrella species. So, deer, turkey, they're not as specialist as quail are, but quail habitat is habitat for those species as well. So we can manage for all of them. All right. So, all right. So I'm going to talk very briefly kind of about a pathway to habitat, that framework we kind of think in. So you want to start with your goals. If you don't know what you want to do on your property or what your goal is for a property, if you're a land manager, that's somewhere to start. You need to know what you want to know what to do. And sometimes wildlife is a great way to approach it, saying, "Oh, I want wildlife habitat." But the more specific you can get, the better, because something a cerulean warbler, a canopy nesting warbler, once is not what a Puritan tiger beetle, which is like a sandy beach specialist, will want. And that's two; those are both wildlife. So you have to know what you want to manage for, in order to know what you want to do. And two important steps, if you're kind of starting from scratch, and you have an area that's like lawn or something, is to do site prep and establishment work. So that's removing what you have there, and then establishing what you want there, where that management might be a little bit different than what it would be like when you eventually get it to a state where you can just manage it. But you can go directly from goals to what I would consider a management action, especially like in forest, where you don't have to deal with, well, shouldn't say deal with, but you don't have to worry about the site prep and the establishment parts. It's more of you do a management action and you'll have the impact that you want. So a big one that me and Sierra often go through with people are wildflower meadow planting. At least that's the way I like to think about it. Wildlife habitat planting, which is really establishing native herbaceous plants. So grasses, forbs, wildflowers, legumes, and there's some overlap in those groups. But all those to provide nesting and brooding habitat for quail, which provides food in the form of insects and seeds, as well as cover, for quail. Also pollinator habitat. So this on the left actually is a picture from a site that our local chapter of Quail Forever here in Maryland and Delaware, they cover both states, helped plant. So they paid part of the seed cost for that beautiful black-eyed Susan stand. And the important thing to think here is that you want to way prefer forbs over grasses. You will get grasses over time. They will eventually dominate a stand. What you're going to lose over time is forbs, so you have to manage for those specifically. Prescribed fire, as we talked about, fire is important, and prescribed fire is a growing topic of interest in both states. Um, and it's using fire safely, in a way that it can be a perfectly natural disturbance that all of our native plants are used to, all of our wildlife are used to, that you're able to then utilize to finish your goals. You just want to make sure you have the right permits and you have access to personnel. But also, if you're going through the rigmarole to get that done, keep in mind that you will increase plant vigor because our native plants are used to that happening, and they have their roots still established, so they're able to sprout up afterwards and create beautiful landscapes. And also, you'll have that bare ground for quail, and for ground nesting bees and all sorts of other wildlife as well. Forestry practices. Forest stand improvement is one that, if Sierra and I meet with a farmer who maybe, taking something out of production just won't work, cropland, it's just, they maybe have very small areas, or they're just, the financial hit would just be too much. And, their priority is production, then, forest is a good place to start. Um, and this usually involves removal of some sort. Here in Maryland, I assume it's the same in Delaware. You want to get a forest management plan to do anything if you own over 5 acres of woods. But you can achieve many goals through this. You can get some revenue, but you can also create great habitat. And if you have a plan to manage it after you thin it, it can be fantastic quail habitat, like that area on the left, that pine savanna, which I think that picture is from Virginia. And another important one to go over is chemical, or well, is vegetation control. It usually involves chemicals. So that's removing herbaceous weeds and brush. So this is usually focused on invasive species. So there's Sericea lespedeza on the left, an absolute scourge of a plant. Actually, it was once planted for wildlife, but we later found out that the seeds are indigestible for quail, so they can actually lose weight while eating the seeds. And it will also create a monoculture in an area by crowding out native plants. And there's not as many native insects that are host on Sericea. So it really is just like an absolute triple whammy for a lot of our wildlife. And it's the same case with this is Tree of Heaven here and Autumn Olive up here, where there could be aspects of them that maybe are good, but eventually it crowds out the native vegetation that our native species are adapted to. And it usually involves chemical and mechanical treatment. You can do it purely mechanically, especially at a small scale, but chemical over large acreages is usually more effective. You can target specific species with certain chemical types, timing, and obviously if you're using chemicals, please read the label. And there's tons of other useful practices. Oh, I just went ahead and skipped. There's planting shrubs, obviously, the first two there. Hedgerows used to be very prominent here on the Delmarva Peninsula. And now, there's less and less and less of them every year that goes by. And it really was probably those hedgerows that were maintaining our high quail populations into the 70s and 80s. And the removal of those was a big, big aspect of their decline. Management, there's scenarios where maybe fire isn't the way to do it, so you might disc or mow or whatever might make sense. We deal with wetland restoration. Sierra and I usually will work with other people to get that done. Ducks Unlimited does a lot of work with that with private landowners as well and government agencies. Structures for wildlife is one that will include, so that's bat bee bird boxes, and for quail, brush piles. So if you ever do a forest manipulation, you can use some of the slash that comes along with that harvest and make wonderful brush piles for cottontails and quail. In buffers, borders, and filter strips, there's a little star there because water quality is the main concern with buffers and filter strips usually, but you can incorporate wildlife friendly plants rather than dense monocultures of cool season grasses, which is generally what we want to avoid. If you really want, you can definitely introduce forbs and warm season grasses instead. And then if you do work in a livestock area, Sierra and I don't deal with this as much here on the Delmarva, but out in Western Maryland, central Western Maryland, and in Western Virginia, there's lots of work with livestock producers where you can do forage plantings, you include native species, or you could do prescribed grazing, where you're doing a rotation to really encourage grassland habitat. All right, now I'm going to talk about assistance really quick. So there are federal, state, and NGO programs that exist out there to help private landowners do things. And there's really a whole suite from small scale to extremely large scale. There's really any option out there if you're interested in it to research, if you do own property like that, or you have someone that that's interested in that to share. And I won't be able to get to all of them. But the first thing to start with is that Sierra and I do provide technical assistance, and there's other groups that do this too, where really we just provide professional advice, where we go out to someone's property, we kind of go out there with them, we might help that landowner identify their priorities, and sometimes that may not be the thing that they say. It may be a little bit different. Aesthetics might be more important than people want to admit firsthand, and you have to work that out. But we also, provide management advice, native seed mixes that they might want to consider for their site, because a lot of those, market wildflower meadow mixes are a lot of non-native species that'll just show in the first year and will be gone after that. And we may also make a habitat management plan if that's what they're interested in also. And we can connect those landowners with financial assistance. And this is all totally free, by the way. So federal assistance also. So Sierra and I work out of USDA offices, where there's two main agencies. There's the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, who we work with a little bit, I would say a little bit more, because they have 3 different programs: the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, Conservation Stewardship Program, and easements, wetland easements. That's those 3 acronyms there. And then FSA, which is the Farm Service Agency, which administers CRP, which is Conservation Reserve Program. And with states, Delaware and Maryland, CREP, which is essentially state enhancement. And I'll go over that again here. So federal assistance, these 2 programs, EQIP and CSP, are competitive programs where you sign up for a contract. For CSP, it's 5 years. For EQIP, it's anywhere from 2 to 10 years, where you get a cost share via reimbursement. So it's not full pay, but you get a percentage of the cost to do something. And you can re-enroll and do things again and again. It just requires a process to go through with contracting and everything that you then have to follow. And there's tons of practices in there. So this is, if this is something you or someone you know is interested in, this exists at their local soil conservation district offices. There's also easements where you can do 30-year or permanent easements, where if it's the 30-year, there's cost share. If it's permanent, NRCS will pay the full restoration cost for your property, which means you can't necessarily farm it or anything, at least in the sections that you enroll, but they will pay whatever costs it takes to restore it. And they'll probably there has to be a wetland component to it, so you're going to restore the hydrology that was there at one time. But that can be a great, I guess, kind of think of it as like almost a private reserve for wildlife, because you're still allowed to do recreation on that property too. It's still yours technically. You just it's an easement for having that hydrology restored. And then here's CRP, which is usually 10 to 15-year contracts where you enroll an area that has cropping history, and you put cover on there instead of cropping it. And you can do complete native plants in this. CREP is a state incentivized one where the state will put a little bit more money into it. Maryland or Delaware will put a little bit more money into certain practices that they want to see done in Maryland, that revolves around the bay. So riparian buffers and wetlands are really, really highly ranked. And then there's all sorts of state and NGO things out there for you through your local DNR or DNREC. Quail Forever has a few things as well. It's still kind of becoming more of a presence here. Your local districts might have money pots for particular projects that maybe can't be funded through these other avenues. And extension offices exist too to talk to. So that's assistance. And then I'm going to go through a quick thing about application of some of these practices on a landscape level. So these aren't real examples, but they're kind of the example of the ideal of what we're kind of shooting for. So this landscape, we've got several different landowners. Maybe we have a first landowner decide that they want to do a feathered edge, which is, maybe 50 to 100 foot into the woods. They cut out most of their mature trees and they let that grow up into shrubs to provide really successional habitat, and maybe put in some pollinator plantings on less productive areas or along the roadside. Maybe their neighbor sees the feathered edge and they decide, that maybe there's a quail or pheasant population north of there that they want to try to get to start to occupy these areas. Maybe it's a few miles away. But they're kind of on that edge of it. So they decide that they're going to put their own feathered edge in and put some pollinator plantings along their lanes as well. And then, another neighbor might do it, put some warm season grasses in that, maybe they go ahead and hay out once a year. So they make a little bit off of it, but it's also still providing pretty good wildlife habitat. And then, that it kind of expands across the landscape as more and more neighbors get interested. And maybe this neighbor decides to thin this section, treat some invasive species, and this one over here decides that they want to do more pollinator stuff. And then, over time, you create kind of a gradient across the landscape and increase that connectivity across neighbors. And that's kind of the goal with our positions is to get that interest. So neighbors are really creating those strips, which will make arguably make the environment more beautiful with some of those forbs and wildflowers, while also increasing wildlife populations and connectivity across the landscape. And those forest edges too, you're going to have more of a transition. Instead of a hard edge from mature forest to cropland, you have a soft edge where you have, shrubs in between. So you're kind of providing for species that use not just open fields and not just mature forest, but all the stuff that occurs in between. And then we have a smaller scale here, just because I'm not totally sure who's going to be in the audience, where it's just kind of the same thing, but at a smaller scale. So, I mean, these are kind of look like little mansions. But, even within whatever scale you're looking at, this definitely applies. So, maybe you start with the pollinator planting, this person here, and they decide that went really well. And they'll, maybe they're going to treat this back here. They've got a lot of sod grass back here that they need to get rid of, that then they can convert into a pollinator planting. And And then over here, they decided that they've got tons of multiflora rose and tree of heaven that they're going to try to deal with, and to increase native species in there instead. And maybe their neighbor really likes that pollinator planting, or this neighbor on the right decides that their neighbor over here to the left, they can help them out by helping them plant that and get them started on their journey. Um, and then, have a little bit more pollinator plantings, and maybe over here, they like that autumn grass look. So they're going to go ahead and put some warm season grasses in and also deal with their invasives. So really the goal here is to increase the connectivity no matter what scale you're looking at, and to really, really get the landscape interested, because, we have success stories here in the shore where we have populations of quail, but it's really centered on places that are being managed specifically for them. And they're not really occurring at the landscape level anymore. So that's kind of what we're trying to get going again. So that's kind of it. Thank you. Our contact information is here again. If you need to take a picture, definitely feel free to email, call, text, anything. And then we also have the chapter information down here. I mentioned earlier they funded that habitat planting at WMA in Queen Anne's County. That's where that was. It's called Brown's Branch. It's relatively new, and they helped fund that. So the chapter does really cool stuff too. So if you're more on the action side, that might be a good place to reach out if you're interested. But yeah, thank you all. I don't know if there's questions in the chat or anything, so I can stop the share and we can see what's going on. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jack and Sierra. We'll unshare, come back, and we'll put a spotlight on both of y'all. If I can do that, one spotlight, add spotlight. Okay, now we can open it up for Q&A. Thank you. That was fascinating. You can put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you to ask a question. Karen asked about feral cats and as a predator. Are you tracking anything with that with the quail?
So we're not tracking that directly. Predators is a big current that a lot of landowners that we meet with are really interested in, and that certainly has an impact on quail populations. But from the data that I have seen, and that a lot of quail researchers across the Southeast have looked at, usually if you have quality habitat on the landscape, quail should be able to deal with any predation, any natural predation that happens. But I will say cats are definitely a factor in a lot of wildlife populations, especially birds. There's data on, I'm not sure if you've had anyone present on it, on any issue like that, but it's something like 1 to 2 billion birds a year eaten by feral cats across the US. So it's definitely an issue, but it's not something where we are particularly concerned about it for quail over any other predator. So yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, those statistics blow your mind when you see them. Sally wants to know what the home range of quail is and how much space do you need to call the birds in?
That is also a good question. We often have people ask, and that's kind of why we bring up the neighbor thing, because we'll often have people come and be like, oh, I have this 5-acre area that I'm interested in doing something on. And yes, you won't have a sustained quail population on 5 acres. But if your neighbors all have 5 acres and you have 10 neighbors, that's quite a bit more. And you can have, a lot more quail in the landscape if you do something like that. Generally, it's believed that you need about 500 acres kind of starting to have a sustained quail population in an area, of relatively connected habitat. And obviously, the more you have, the denser your populations can get. I don't know if Sierra has anything more particular.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much, I know it's kind of a daunting number that Jack kind of gave, but it is important to remember. I mean, we'll have somebody come to us about they want to do a pollinator planting in their backyard, and we're happy to do it. There's nothing that is ever too small because you're still contributing to the larger picture. So, even if you start with it and none of your neighbors are interested, by you doing something and then maybe them seeing your success, you know, that also influences, you know, maybe somebody else wants to do something in their backyard. And you know, it's the same with these larger scale operations. You know, you start with something small and then you can move from that. But you know, their home range overall isn't very big. I mean, they usually, I mean, they'll move around a little bit, but for the most part, they're staying within like 1 to 5 miles,
Yeah.
for the most part. So, you know, it's not like they don't disperse very much. So they definitely need that really close connectivity. And again, like we mentioned, they everything eats quail. So you know, it doesn't take much if they don't have that cover or they don't have that corridor that they can move through to get from one place to the other, then you know, it's not usually successful. So that's what we see right now in Maryland and Delaware. We do have wild quail populations, but they're just really isolated because they can't really get from one place to the other. So the important thing is that there's at least a corridor, so which doesn't need to be much. So you'll still see quail, they just may not be staying there. You know, they might just be using that to kind of get from one place to the other, you know, as we kind of hopefully start to get more connection going.
All right, Steve is asking, are game breeders that raise quail for hunting licensed, and are they inspected?
I don't know about the inspection, but I do know that if you're releasing for hunting, you should be licensed. There is a license involved with the state. I think you have to register as like a game bird preserve or something, which I don't think has anything more than I will be releasing them for hunting. But yes, there is a process to that. I don't know if Sierra knows anymore, but that's the case in Maryland at least.
Yeah. Yeah, that's as far as I know. It's the same thing. And usually those are, you know, put and take operations. So there has been a lot of you know, looking into whether you can release pen raised quail or even quail that are raised outside. And you know, unfortunately they don't have much success. Turkey were a different story. It was great. You know, they released a lot of turkey and it ended up working. And now we have a lot more turkey than we used to. But quail, for some reason, they just don't seem to do well, especially when they're pen raised. So we really rely on those wild populations to move across the landscape.
Okay. I had a question about the, you know, you mentioned that pre-settlement days and historically, has there been any way to calculate what the population of quail was before in prehistorical times?
That's it.
I'm just
Yeah.
asking that because you had old growth forests, and then you talked about the settlers coming in and taking down some of the forests that increased the habitat for the quail, and now we're going in the opposite direction where things are getting out of production and going back into forest, reducing the habitat for quail. But what do we know anything about what that number is? What's the magic number, or the number before that? It was fire the only way that it was being the landscape was being controlled for quail populations?
No, I wouldn't say it was the only way. You know, in our area, a lot of the Native American groups that lived here also had agriculture. So there was some aspect of that. Obviously, it was on a way smaller scale than it is nowadays, but there would have been small clearings. I don't know of any numbers, and this certainly isn't my area of expertise, but I know that they were here pre-settlement, like in our area. And quail have a fossil history over 1 million years in North America. So, you know, they would have coexisted with mastodons and giant ground sloths, and who knows whether or not that was up here in Maryland for that whole time frame. Probably not. But you know, they lived on the landscape for a long time, and you know, nature's dynamic over time, and those old growth forests that we had back in the day in a lot of areas. You know, it wasn't necessarily all closed canopy either. And quail can survive in more savanna type ecosystems where you might look at it and say, yeah, that's a forest, but it's not a closed forest system. So yeah, I don't know any magic numbers. But I know that there's been documented decline since the 1890s. And a lot of people kind of think of the heyday as the 1960s, but it probably was a drop off from even what they were before that. So,
Yeah, and I think it's kind of tough because, a lot of that monitoring wasn't done. Then like Jack kind of mentioned, there was the market hunting and everything. So it was pretty focused on the harvest, and there was a lot of value to doing those things. But the breeding bird survey has been going on for what, over 100 years. So there's at least that kind of data. I mean, obviously it's changed a little bit over time, but you can at least go back pretty far. And I mean, I can at least say, back in the 60s, Delaware had the highest concentration of quail in the nation, of bobwhite specifically, within the range. So not necessarily the most quail, just the highest density. And then, kind of what we saw from that graph, they, really declined a lot.
Karen asks, is anyone trapping the live quail and transplanting them in other locations like they did with the turkeys?
yes.
So,
not. Oh, sorry. You want to go, Sarah?
Oh yeah, no, you're good.
I was going to say, yes, but not in Maryland or Delaware. So there's a lot of interest with that. Obviously, someone has 40 acres of habitat or whatever, they've been working on habitat and they're like, I want quail. And it makes sense, they put in a lot of effort for it. It's just our wild populations are so low here, and so isolated, and there's a lot of manpower and effort, and there's a lot of mortality moving them around too. And wild birds is the way to go if you have to release. But there's just a lot of factors that go into it where we're not quite at the stage yet. I'm talking with the game bird biologist here in Maryland, where that's really something that is being considered. But in near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which is kind of up, I guess, towards like Hagerstown area, kind of over. They're doing a introduction of quail on Letterkenny Army Depot, which is like 3,000 or 4,000 acres of fire maintained early successional habitat, and they're seeing how that's going. So there's efforts to do it, and those quail are coming from an army fort in Virginia and from Tall Timber Station in Florida and maybe a couple other places. So it's something that's happening.
Yeah. So they'll do it. But that is, we know that you have to have a very large acreage of well-established, maintained habitat for them to be successful, because again, their home range, they don't move around too much in their lifetime. So even moving them from one place to another kind of can throw them off, and there's a lot of mortality even that way. So you have to really make sure that it is a lot of good habitat that they can use to be able to survive. So like right now, like Jack was saying, it's just focusing on building the habitat, and down the line, maybe once the populations we do have are able to expand as much as they can, there's more habitat, the population is strong enough. And if there's just not a realistic connection between the two. So a lot of times I reference Dover. I mean, Dover is in the middle of the state. And we have, wild quail up, in lower Newcastle County. And then you have Dover, and then down lower, we have a nice big area that is being worked on now. Realistically, they may not, unless they kind of go around, or, there's connection around, which is possible. Maybe potentially, down the line, if there's enough habitat down there and we're seeing realistically they can't move there naturally, that is a possibility. But again, it's focusing on making sure that habitat is there first, and there's a lot of it.
Right, because doing a small scale, if you're not doing something, well, one, the effort to put in to get them there, you want to have a good chance for success, but two, they were eliminated from the landscape for a reason too. So you have to consider that. So there has to be a lot of work to address why they're gone in the first place before you try to let them go again too, which I think is kind of the approach that's being taken. But there's a decent amount of work going on habitat wise. So definitely potential for it.
If you build it, they will come, right? That's the mantra.
That's it.
Yeah. So I had a natural history question about the covey. part of it. When they're in that area, are they actively going out and feeding during the days and coming back to that? I mean, are they kind of hunkered down?
Yeah, I mean, they're still out and feeding. They're just staying kind of in that group. When it's breeding season, for the most part, I mean, other than, if they're with a mate, they're not really traveling in groups or anything. They're pretty solitary. But in the winter, I think it's more of a power and numbers kind of thing. So yeah, they'll stick together and they'll forage together. And then at nighttime, they kind of do that little covey bundle.
That's so cool. Have y'all seen one of those? We go out at night and look for those.
Oh,
I haven't. And it's hard to see it unless you do get like, a lot of times they pick you up before you get a chance to really see them. So by the time you do see them, they flushed. So that's when you see. But like I said, there is that really cool drone footage of like that red ring that's just like on the ground. I think that's kind of the best way. Unless you really do a good job at sneaking up on them, and it's hard to know where they are in the first place anyway because they're really hunkered down at nighttime.
Right.
But
and hunters they like that aspect of it, because unless you have a dog, you don't know where they are, and then even if you have a dog, you don't know when they're going to flush in front of you. So it's like a whole, if you ever were to find them, you would know, because you'd probably have multiple flush up. It's like if you've ever flushed a woodcock, but you can imagine there's 10 of them instead of just one. So
very cool, very cool. All right, any other questions for Jack and Sierra on quail in Delmarva in Maryland? I have one more question. Was there home range throughout Maryland, or was it always concentrated more on the eastern shore, and then it just kind of has gone back down towards that because of habitat, or
yes, I think you hit it right there. Yeah, it used to be across, eastern shore and southern and central Maryland, really. Mountains is probably a little bit of a different story. But they probably occurred way out towards, where it starts to get hilly again, in Washington County. They were all the way out there. And it's really just been a loss since then. And we only have them on the eastern shore now. Into the 2000s, arguably, they were still in southern Maryland. But nowadays, unfortunately, they're mostly extirpated from there. But they still live in the northern neck of Virginia, which is just across the Potomac. So, there's potential. So
you have
yeah,
seed
it used
banks.
to be in most of the state. I think southern Maryland, there used to be a lot of them. So
all right, we got to get working on that. All right, anybody from southern Maryland, we got to start building for the quail. All right, well, thank you so much, Sierra and Jack, for sharing your knowledge and the wonderful work that you're doing. We want to thank you for all of the work that you are doing to help the quail populations here in Maryland and Delaware. And thank you all for joining us tonight for Must Learn Thursday. You have their contact information if you need to get in touch with them. And stay well, stay curious, stay outside, keep looking for those quail. Go to the eastern shore, see if you can see them. If you can't, build a habitat for them and they will come. And Sierra and Jack will help you do that. So everybody take care. We'll see you next time for, I think it's ferns of Maryland, native ferns of Maryland. Take care, everybody.
thank you all.
thank you.